Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Tatiana Shalkivska, and I am with the Hydromet team of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, GFDRR, the World Bank. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the third webinar of the Global Weather Enterprise Forum, entitled A Collaborative Future of the Weather Enterprise, a Private Sector Perspective. Before we begin, let me brief you on some housekeeping policies. During the webinar, please kindly mute your microphone, disable your video, wave your hand to ask a question during the Q&A session, and use chat for questions, comments, and suggestions. This event is video recorded, and the recording will be available along with the presentation at a later date. Having said that, let me introduce Vladimir Tsurkunov, lead specialist, head of the World Bank GFDRR Hydromet program, who will make the overview of the event. Over to you, Vladimir.
Thanks, Tanya. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and warm welcome to our regular and new participants of this Global Weather Enterprise event. What I can see on the screen, we're quickly approaching to 100 participants connected already. And again, I can see from the list that many of you participated last December in the first Global Weather Enterprise online forum, where 6 experts panelists discussed legislative frameworks that enable public-private engagement. That event, organized jointly with WMO, was quite successful, and we hope that this one will be successful too. This particular event is, as already Tanya mentioned, is the third Global Weather Enterprise Forum webinar titled A Collaborative Future of the Weather Enterprise, Private Sector Perspective. Again, some of you may recall 2 previous webinars where academic and public sector perspective have been discussed at length. This time we will hear the view of the third leg of the Global Weather Enterprise, presented by a well-known representative of the private sector, Peter Platzer, whom I will more formally introduce in a few minutes after opening remarks, which will be made by my manager, Ms. Maitreyi Das. Let me say a few words about Maitreyi. Maitreyi Das is a manager in the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and the Lang Global Practice. Based in Washington, D.C., she works on a set of issues that have to do with reducing inequality and exclusion. She has worked in both human development and infrastructure-related areas at the World Bank. Of this, social protection, social development, health, urban development, and water and sanitation stand out. She has a PhD in sociology, demography, from the University of Maryland. Before joining the World Bank, Maitreyi was in the Indian Administrative Service. Dear Maitreyi, floor is yours for opening remarks, please.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Vladimir. So, Vladimir, I take it that you will introduce Peter.
Correct.
Excellent. I was hoping to introduce Peter, but I think you're a better, you will do a better job of doing that. I just want to use this opportunity to welcome our participants to this extremely important webinar. I know I actually got emails from people saying it was great that you have Peter Platzer coming to speak, and which means he's of course very well known, and it's really a pleasure to host him at the World Bank virtually. So the topic today that Peter is going to speak about, it's really at the crux of the Global Enterprise Forum. And the private sector has been a part of the Hydromet system for a while, but as Vladimir pointed out, we have tended to focus a lot more on the public sector and less so on the private sector. But I think what Peter, and I hope what Peter brings to the table today, is that unless we have a private-public partnership, and I would say within private, we would bring in academia as well, which could be the public or private academia, a set of stakeholders that come together in order to have much more predictable, much more accessible, and much more, I would say, affordable hydromet services. And that is the crux of what the kind of knowledge and the kind of expertise that we offer to our clients at the World Bank. We at the World Bank actually came up with a report last year, 2 years ago. It was called The Power of Partnership on Public and Private Engagement in Hydromet. And Peter's talk, I hope, will speak directly to some of those issues that are really intrinsic to the cooperation between different sectors and how we can take that forward. I want to anticipate your talk, Peter, and hope that you will bring out 3 aspects. One is, of course, the importance of partnerships, not just the private sector, the public sector, but also things like citizens groups that are very powerful in many places that make use of hydromet services, and academia for sure, because without academic research, we're not going to be able to advance the agenda at all. So the power of partnerships is what I hope that we'll hear from you. The second is the regulatory environment. Unless we have legal frameworks that basically enable much better hydromet services to be accessible and affordable, we're not going to be able to make much headway if there are barriers, both regulatory barriers as well as not enough regulation. So you need that balance of enough regulation but not too much regulation in order to take the agenda forward. And finally, related to this is open data. Unless data sets and data satellite imaging, to give you just one example, is available to people that can use it, to people that can be nimble in using some of the data, we are not going to be able to make the kind of dent that we want to make in order to provide democratically available services to the most at risk of extreme weather events. So with that, let me close and say very big welcome to you, Peter, and a very big welcome to our participants. And thank you very much, Vladimir. It's back over to you.
Thank you, Maitreyi, for very substantive and interesting points. I'm sure that Peter will respond with all his eloquencies, and let me brief participants on formal side who Peter is. Peter Platzer co-founded Spire in 2012 with a vision to provide satellite-powered data solutions to problems on Earth. The company's audacious goal is to double global GDP growth by eliminating the negative economic impact from inaccurate weather forecasts in the era of climate change. Platzer is now regarded as one of the pioneers in launching small form factor satellites into space and was named by President Obama a White House champion of change in 2013. Prior to launching Spire, Peter trained at CERN and the Max Planck Institute before turning to business with the Boston Consulting Group in Europe and Asia, and serving as a quantitative investment manager for almost a decade on Wall Street. Peter received an MS in physics from the Technical University of Vienna and MBA from Harvard, where he was a Baker Scholar, and MS cum laude in space science from the ISU Strasbourg. Peter, pleasure to introduce yourself, and floor is yours. Before your speak, can I ask participants who did not switch off their cameras do so? It will help everybody. Peter, please proceed.
It's a great pleasure for me to be sharing some of my personal views with you today. I mean, for me, the weather enterprise is almost inextricably linked with, one of the probably largest generational challenges we all face, which is tackling climate change, as that is through the weather how we experience the impact of climate change, and that impact is happening, virtually, everywhere on the globe. There isn't almost any industry which is not impacted by the weather to some degree, and there have been estimates that surprise weather events, generate up to $3 trillion annually of economic loss, which is only going to increase, according to a study from the McKinsey Global Institute, that might increase, by almost 60% by 2050, as climate change is impacting ever more industries. And for many decades, the public and the private sector have highly effectively and efficiently collaborated to provide satellite weather data. Right, the public sector provided the funds, and all the satellites have been built by the private sector, right? And I think it's important to point out that satellite weather data, as well as any weather data, even though I'm going to take here more of a view around satellites because I'm personally a little bit more familiar with it, it generally applies to all data sources, right? Satellite weather data has never been free. As a matter of fact, I would argue it is reasonably large sums of money that have been spent here, right? We're talking literally billions of dollars that the various governments across the world have given the private sector to build those satellites. However, the launch and the operation and the provision of that weather data has never been without risks and trade-offs for the public sector. Be that by having to launch technology that you wouldn't want to gift your kids an iPhone or a cell phone with, or very, very long delays in launch time. And let's not forget some difficulties and then operating those instruments after they have been launched, with all of the risk being borne by the public sector, right? However, what is also true is that those instruments and the analysis and the analytics that the public sector then derives from those private sector satellites purchased and owned and operated by the public sector vastly outweighs the spending for those instruments. I would actually argue that that's one of the tragedies of the global weather enterprise, that the funds being made available are a fraction of the benefits derived. And I'm not sure that that massive return on investment that the weather enterprise is producing, for the public sector is really something, top of mind when people think about it, the same way they understand, the importance of the global positioning system, like be it GPS or be it Galileo, because everyone is using maps and they're happy when they find their way home again. And so they appreciate the importance of that, even though also there, the deep importance and embeddedness of that benefit from space in the everyday economy is not really, really apparent. However, what we have been seeing, in the last few years is that the improvements in forecast accuracy, which used to be very reliably, about a day, a decade, have actually been slowing down potentially a little bit, right? And that is happening, at the same time as the impact and risk of climate change is rising. So at a crucial moment in time, we find ourselves at a waypoint where the need is increasing and the improvement speed is actually decreasing. I think one of the potential, remedies for that is that, we are also finding ourselves at a point in time where new technologies are emerging, which, could contribute potentially to reversing this trend. I'm talking here about satellite data. I'm talking about the emergence of small satellites, the size of a bottle of wine, or maybe a fridge, that have been starting to dominate the number of satellites that have been launched, in the last few years. and carry the potential, to dramatically increase the available data for weather prediction. An example here is radio occultation data, a data which is exceptionally well understood. And because of that new technology emergence, the private sector now can potentially contribute substantially amounts of data here that can have a potentially, a large impact of weather prediction. It's not just new technologies that are emerging. I think the other thing that we start to see emerge is new business models, right? And they are not entirely new, I think entirely accurate, right? Like they follow trends from other industries, right? If you think of data storage, historically, you would buy storage devices, so, like hard drives, network attached storage devices, we even used to have at our home. And today, generally storage is cloud-based storage. Both consumers, most of us have a Dropbox or a Box or a Google Cloud Drive account, rather than large, stacks of hard drives at home. And the same is true in the business world, right? It's not just storage, of course, it's also computing, where we move from a world of building a server to run an operator business to using an AWS, an Azure, a GCP, or others. And most software today is actually not, purchased and then installed, but most of the software that businesses use, from payments to procurement, to payroll to analytics, is actually procured as a software as a service, delivered very often through an API or even through a front end and charged on a monthly basis, right? And they are just very, very clear reasons and benefits for that model, which has driven, the large and rapid adoption by customers, right? The first one is the certainty of price. If you purchase a software as a service, you know exactly what you're going to pay on a monthly basis, versus let's take buying a satellite. It wouldn't be unheard of to have a satellite project be above budget, right? Similar to let's say you're renting a hotel room versus you're building a house, right? So both the price certainty as well as the schedule certainty is one of the things that has driven this customer adoption, because I can just turn on the service and then I start procuring that service, and I have a very, very high certainty of the schedule, especially as I always have this leverage as a customer of like, well, if you don't give me the service, I'm just not gonna pay you, right? Which is much more difficult to do if someone is building your house and you're in 80% of the cost, and then he says, well, sorry, it's gonna take 6 months longer. What are you gonna do at this point in time, right? The same thing, of course, is true with like the service quality, right? If you procure a service and you have a service level agreement there, it's very simple. If the service is not fulfilling the service level agreement, well, then you're just simply not going to pay, or you pay less. But if you purchased an asset and then that asset degrades in its service quality, well, it's like your asset, right? That's a little bit, the problem. And the last thing that customers really, really like about this procurement of a service is that they can flexibly grow their purchasing with the budget and the need that they have, right? If you are running let's say a cloud storage need, you have a need to store data. If you build your own server farm to store the data, you're going to have to decide, well, how big a storage farm do I buy, do I build? Versus if you buy it as a service, you can just increase it, right? You start out with a free 250 megabyte Dropbox account, and as you have a bigger need, well, you start with buying a gigabyte for $5 a month, and if you then have more data, you can just increase your account. So those are some of the big drivers that have driven the customer adoption of those business models. And those business models, have also been deployed in most space sectors with great success, right? Satellite telecommunications, also started out with, the public sector purchasing a satellite, to use then. But today, the majority of public sector needs is actually purchased as a service from commercial telecommunication satellite companies, right? Same thing with imagery, same progression, started out as almost exclusively purchasing satellites. Today, a large portion of many governments' needs are actually purchased as a subscription, as a service. And last but certainly not least, we see the same thing in launch, where it used to be almost exclusively government-owned vehicles providing certain space transportation services that today in certain sectors are provided by the private sector as a service, up to 90%. And I think what's exciting here in the weather space is that we not just have those new technologies emerging, as we talked about beforehand, the emergence of highly capable small form factor satellites that operate in large constellations. We also have these new business models starting to emerging, where the public sector increasingly has the option to follow that successful path of satellite communication, satellite imagery, satellite launch to procure satellite weather data, not just as an asset, but also as a service. I think it's also worthwhile to point out that this is something which is already here and operational at scale, right? Starting with radio occultation, the private sector today is operationally at quite a large scale, providing and producing more radio occultation data than the public sector does, and has the ability to collaborate here in a highly effective and efficient way. What you see here at the bottom is the collaboration between the private sector and ECMWF, as well as the UK Met Office, in 2020, where there was a loss of aircraft data, which had an impact on forecast accuracy. And luckily, over a very short period of time, first, the public sector constellation Cosmic 2 got moved into operation. And then additionally, private sector data was provided and absorbed on an operational basis, which then together actually made radio occultation the fourth most relevant data type with regards to forecast error reduction. And this is not just for radio occultation. The private sector today, has demonstrated, in certain instances, even at scale, the provision of surface wind speed, soil moisture, sea ice data, through the provision of GNSS reflectometry. There has been demonstrations of polarimetric RO for rain content, for microwave soundings, particles, radiation, IR soundings. All of those have been demonstrated from smaller satellites, sometimes by the private sector and sometimes by the public sector. So there clearly is, the operational potential to have large-scale constellation providing data reliably as a service to the public sector to tackle, this generation challenge we face, adaptation to climate change, by making weather just a little bit more predictable and further out. as we can feed substantially more data into ever more sophisticated operational models. However, I think we have to be honest that there are still some challenges that exist in this, potential collaboration. I think while the other satellite sectors, telecommunication, imagery, and launch, have gone through that transition, there still is a certain amount of customer trust not fully yet established with data providers, right? There's still some misinformation, rumors, maybe some lack of dialogue that I think some of us have experienced, and I think is something we all together can and work through to really unleash that potential. I think it's also true that the public sector often is a little bit hamstrung by the contract vehicles that are made available to the public sector to procure this data, because they currently are, at least in certain instances, more geared towards the purchase of assets, even if that means cost overruns and budget overruns, and they're not as easily adopted to procuring services. Now, again, this has been overcome in satellite communications, in satellite imagery, in satellite launch. So clearly the pathway and the mechanisms for that exists. But I think we have to recognize that it might be a process we still have to go through, right? As with all kind of combinations of large, world-class institutions and more innovative, smaller and medium enterprise players, there is sometimes a bit of an imbalance between the scale and the speed of market adoption. And I think that is kind of like a almost classic problem that all industries, have faced and overcome. But I think it's worthwhile to call out, right? And hand in glove with that comes, sometimes a cultural challenge, that innovative small private sector entities not always fully appreciate, the constraints and the cultural identity of the long established processes and the tried and proven path of public entities, right? And likewise, I think that change from controlling, how something is done and purchasing an asset to controlling the budget and controlling the timeline and controlling, the quality, through SLAs and only paying if those are met. That is a change in thinking that some organizations have an easier time doing than others, right? So I think we have to be open and aware of those challenges and collaboratively work through them and understand when there maybe are misunderstandings that are clear why they are there, but they're still inhibiting some of the improvements. Just taking one of them is kind of like a thing that I've heard many times, that private sector companies are against data sharing, right? And that kind of like is bad for the business model. And nothing could be further from the truth, right? It's just factually wrong. And as someone operating in the private sector, I can tell you that it is just factually wrong, right? If we take the example of something that many of you might be familiar with, I certainly am, licensing of academic journals. That clearly the price per article and user changes as you go from buying a single license for a single article to buying a license for a full journal, or buying a Compass license for a whole set of articles. But the total price goes up, but the price per article and user comes down, right? And so why do private companies do that? Because for them, larger customers leads to lower sales cost and less customer support, and that's the justification for bulk order discounts, right? And from a customer perspective, it means that, I can buy exactly the rights that I need with the detailed granularity to meet my budget and needs, right? And so with regards to weather data, every customer can purchase exactly the distribution rights that they want, just like they can buy the distribution rights for an academic journal from Elsevier. Hopefully no one says that Elsevier is against access sharing, because they love a Compass license, right? And the same thing is the case for satellite imagery and for satellite communications. The license that the customer wants is delightful to be provided by the provider, but it certainly is one of the misunderstandings that I've heard very, very often, that private sector companies don't support data sharing. It is absolutely not the case. We are delighted for data sharing. We actually delight ourselves in creating, a variety of data sharing pricing models for every customer, so that every customer can choose exactly what kind of data rights make the most sense for their needs and for their budgets. I think for me, the opportunity here is to have a global observing system with not just 10 times the amount of data that we have today, but 100 times the amount of data that we have today, with a fair sharing of the risk and the rewards between the private and the public sector, much of which has been done in the past, but maybe adding some additional layers and benefits that have made private sector companies prefer cloud storage versus buying hard drives, and buying satellite communication services over buying telecommunication satellites for themselves. And with that, I'm excited to conclude and look forward to conversations and questions.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I see that some questions are coming in. We still have, despite some unstable connection, 145 participants to this line. The first question, which arrived to me at least, is the following, Peter. How pervasive you think the satellite miniaturization revolution might be? Will we need to contemplate a mixed model of large and small satellite constellations, with their perhaps different financing business models going forward? So that's a question.
And maybe use technology from an industry that I think has showcased that transformation very, very eloquently. And that is from mainframe computers to network personal computers and the internet. Even today, mainframe computers are absolutely necessary and are actually a very, very large business for a company like IBM. And when we go to some of the really, really big problems, you end up with true supercomputers. So in the computing world, you see this excellent hybrid infrastructure of networks that are highly capable and iterating quickly and networked, with very large, super capable installations, mainframes, and supercomputers. And I firmly believe that the same situation probably should apply in the weather side, because we see it in other government applications where the government in the US, they call it a hybrid infrastructure, is increasingly operating with a view that this distributed infrastructure in combination with large assets is indeed the future.
Thanks, Peter. When you finish, please say that over to you. Otherwise, I can wait a bit longer. Maybe you're still thinking. Okay, another one which I have, and that came from Alan Thorpe. What opportunities, advantages you see for the data as a service model to also apply to the non-satellite observation sector, ground-based and in situ? Back to you.
Yeah, so I think the underlying rationale for providing a service that has created tremendously successful business models, be that in software as a service or cloud computing or cloud storage, really applies to both satellite data as well as ground-based data, where you create like this really nice aligned incentive. The customer says, I will buy a certain subscription from you, which is a very, very reliable and repeatable long-term revenue that makes it very, very easy for the company to plan. And at the same token, from a customer's perspective, they know that the true expert, those that have designed and built those sensors, get to operate them and fix any problems with them. And so I don't think there is actually a particular difference between data from satellites or data from ground-based networks, that the benefits to the customers and the corporations by shifting more and more, like the rest of the global economy has, to a service-based model, data as a service, software as a service, is the right way to go, and would be very beneficial to adopt. And as you know very well, especially when we're talking about some of the developing nations, we run into some issues potentially because the funding mechanisms to support those nations is very often geared to its purchasing assets and not purchasing services, and might not be as sustainable as funding mechanisms that support the purchase of services to really ensure that the people get actually the benefit of those data created from be they ground-based assets or space-based assets. Thank you, Vladimir.
Thanks, Peter. Colleagues, I don't see too many questions on the chat. Please do send it to me, because please feel free to ask questions. Okay, now we're allowed, I think we can. Tatiana, can you please explain how participants, are they able now to unmute themselves and ask direct questions?
Yes, they should wave your hand, and then we'll call on the person to ask a question.
Okay, so they first should switch on the video and then wave hand and etc. Because
yeah.
Okay, so colleagues, those who are interested to ask questions, please switch on your camera, wave your hand like the way I do, and then unmute yourself and go ahead. In the meantime, Peter, I have a quick question, probably 100 million question, which we're facing quite often in our business when we try to improve weather climate services in least development, some developing countries. We have dilemmas where our clients and MHSs in the public sector are very afraid of private sector engagement, and they introduce special legislation which prohibits private sector to deliver without licensing, without restrictions. Do you have any ideas how to change this mindset? You tried in your presentation, but in particular in connection with least developed countries. Any thoughts on your side before we will get more major questions?
I mean, trust is won many years and lost in a second. That's the crux here, right? I mean, I think we have to recognize that natural resources from some of those countries have been exploited by other countries. In that some aid was sometimes coming like a wolves in sheep's clothing to those places, and so a certain amount of mistrust and concern, is very, very understandable. I think it has to be won slowly and over time, but it's not straightforward. I mean, I think I can absolutely empathize with the problem. A friend of mine worked for 2 years at NDP, and she often said, what is often lacking is sitting down and listening. I don't know to what extent that would make a difference, but I think especially the smaller companies have maybe a greater opportunity to sit down and listen and not be perceived as threatening as a global giant.
Okay,
I don't know,
thanks.
it's hard.
Well, I understand it. We're still struggling with finding this proper answer. I saw Michael Stauding your hand wave. Michael, please shoot your question.
Thank you, Vladimir, and hi, Peter. You mentioned Metsukato at the very beginning, and she talks much about innovation being done on the public sector, especially at academia. And academia has to earn the money too, and they're not fully funded in many countries. So which business models would you see between the private sector and academia?
Well, I mean, even though I've spent lots of my time outside of Austria, I think you can't take the Austrian fully out of Austria, out of the Austrian. And I consider knowledge to be a public good, and I'm glad to pay my taxes for the public good. But I think we definitely are facing an onslaught in certain countries. Maybe it's changing now, that knowledge and science have not been particularly well regarded. I think you saw in my presentation calling out that the tremendous amount of societal benefits created by the energy masses of the world, I don't think are necessarily easily understood and known. And so I think that there is a marketing problem, right? The best product does not necessarily win. And that is true in the private sector, and I think that is true in academia as well. I think we need to raise the awareness and appreciation for the value that academia brings to the world, because it is a public good, and I firmly do believe that it should be and shall be funded by taxes. From personal experience, I can tell you that we have tried for 7 years a half dozen or more times to find relationships with academia, and they have failed for two main reasons. The first one being legal, that we have repeatedly got a great excitement and collaboration with the actual researchers to work on a combined project. And then the legal department stepped in and basically said that we as the private sector are allowed to pay for it, but we don't own anything afterwards. If there's anything useful that comes out of the research, we have to license it afterwards, which of course is a nonsensical arrangement. The other problem that we find is that the time scales at which academia has to operate are very, very different how the time scales of a private sector company operates. So, for example, in my personal case, we often go from idea to having a new capability in space deployed in 10, 12 months. It computes for collaboration with academia, who would think of that as a 3-year research project. And I don't think that there's one time frame more right than the other. I think they are different and they lend themselves differently to different problems. So I think the challenge for us to fund academia appropriately to the research that all of us are upon, because without it, it's a very grim future.
Thanks, Peter. Next came from Dimitar. Dimitar, please do ask your question.
Thank you, Vladimir, and thank you, Peter, for this presentation. Excellent as usual, and for all your efforts to promote this the need for building trust and working in close partnership. So I have one question to you. You made a disclaimer at the start that this is a opinion of one representative of the private sector. But how do you see to have a better consolidation of the industry opinion when it comes to very, very important issues that need to be put on the table in front of regulators and organizations like WMO? We have some good partnerships with some associations, but what seems to be lacking is still kind of a consolidated industry voice. This is one thing. And second, how do you look at the ITU model of engaging industry through sector membership? Do you think this could be something that we should try to pursue with WMO?
As always, Dimitar, you make my job very easy because you basically give me the answer with your question. So I think it's actually a mistake to say, oh, let's represent the private sector with some associations. Because let's be honest, you don't do that for the NHMSs. You don't say, well, let's just group the NHMSs into one association per continent and have the WMO have 5 members. Indeed, you have 192 members because every single one of them is actually individually represented and part of the discussion. And it's a bit striking that you don't have that in the private sector. Now, I understand that you couldn't have every single private sector be a participant, but I think there could be a substantially broader participation and representation in the fora that try to tackle the challenge that we all face and make up the global weather enterprise. And so maybe having a few hundred representatives here from the private sector, or maybe even more. And I think the ITU model, I'm not 100% familiar with it, but I do know that at least the largest corporations who can afford it can actually be quite active participants in the ITU discussions. I think the ITU is also like a slightly different because it is allocating a global shared scarce resource. That is, once one person uses it, it is not available to anyone else. I think we are exactly the opposite, right? The more people that use the resource, I'll call it, let's say, data, the more valuable it becomes. The more people contribute, the more everyone else benefits. There is almost like a network benefit that, the more people that participate, the better everything gets. And so I think leaning into this embracing of the private sector to be fully represented and recognized as, a collaborative partner in how we generate this open data to solve weather prediction for the next century would be an interesting idea to explore, at least from my perspective. I don't know if that answered your question, Dimitar, but that's my personal view.
Okay, thanks, Peter. A few more questions which I received. The one from Michael Foley. How easy is to price services? Does this require good long-term forecasts of demand for the service so that you know over what period you need to ride the cost of the investment, for instance, in launching the satellite? That is a question.
Yeah, so the pricing of digital goods is something that has been reasonably well established over the last few decades. It is based on the value derived from it, right? When you think about buying a book on Kindle versus a hardcover book, you pay a similar amount for the Kindle book, maybe a smidgen less. It's more or less the same. And indeed, it is the job of companies to figure out what will be the demand for, a particular book or a particular piece of music or an academic journal or the Netflix, my monthly subscription listen to and not get bored while I'm locked in my house because of the current situation. So indeed, companies have to forecast demand accurately so that indeed they can price their products accurately. But it's not just forecasting the demand. They also have to find good ways to estimate the value that is derived for the customer. Because if I were to write a book about my hobby of collecting ancient calculators, I might be saying the demand for this book is going to be very low. Price it at $10,000 $10 a copy. Well, that might be right from a demand perspective, but about HP1 calculators, it's not going to generate $10,000 of value for 2 years, one of which will probably be my wife. So you also have to assess not just the demand, but you have to assess the value that your product creates, and then price it in a fair way to split that value that you create between your customers and you as a provider. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Peter. There is a kind of follow-up question from, I think, from my colleague from Arati Belli from the World Bank. And it says, one piece of this trust problem is how to curate products and services in terms of accuracy and capabilities. NMHS are not always positioned to evaluate the numerous private sector offers. What would you suggest in terms of collaborative ways for private sector in this regard and for NMHS?
So that is an interesting question because, I'm going to fight a little bit here for the NHMSs because I found them to be extremely knowledgeable to assess and articulate what they need. And when you think about it, they have been doing that for decades, very, very accurately articulating exactly what kind of instruments they want and what kind of instruments they want on the ground and what kind of instruments they want on orbit. Airbus doesn't build a satellite based on what it thinks is nice. It builds a satellite based on what EUMETSAT and the EUMETSAT community communicates to Airbus what the capability of that satellite has to be. And then the NHMSs have an exceptional capability to assess the quality of the data that comes off that satellite once it is finally delivered and launched, and identify if there are problems, be that on the calibration or be other kind of problems, some of which I have pointed out. So I might disagree slightly here on the capability and the sophistication of the NHMSs. I do think that they're actually extremely capable of articulating exactly what they're looking for, and they have been doing that for many, many decades.
Peter, if I may comment, probably the difference is that Arati, being my colleague, deals with least developed and low-level developing countries, where you were dealing with EUMETSAT and much more advanced agencies, which indeed know what they need. And from my personal experience, we do have these problems with our clients, not knowing exactly what they want. But anyway, let's stop my comments. There is another question which came from Francois Amblad. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. The question is, hi, Peter, you mentioned most innovation is coming from the public sector. My feeling is that NMHS, unlike universities, have no IP policy. Do you share this opinion? Would you recommend to develop culture of IP to ease IP transfer? That's a question.
I'm not entirely sure that I completely get the question, but let me answer if what I understand it to be, and maybe Francois, you can fine-tune your question or reiterate it in case I don't answer it correctly. So I think that the public sector generally has most of the time the right approach to IP, in a sense that knowledge shall be free and communicated, right? That is what makes it valuable, right? Knowledge in particular, more so than a whole bunch of other goods, actually increases in value the more it is shared. And it decreases in value if it is not shared, right? And so again, clearly my interactions is limited with regards to NHMSs, but I do see, for example, ECMWF having a very active contribution to the global knowledge around new technologies, like, for example, AI and machine learning for weather. And NOAA, I think, has a fantastic history and culture of publishing research and making both outcomes as well as software publicly available in community approaches. So I'm not if you are asking if NHMSs should have a culture of basically patenting IP and making it restrictive, I think that would be a horrible idea. If your question was, should NHMSs think about making their knowledge more publicly available? I was not aware that they are hoarding it. I feel that they are actually sharing it quite freely. But if there are instances where knowledge and insights are not shared, I think then more sharing is probably better and makes it more valuable in our combined collaborative fight with climate change. Did I answer your question, François? Is that was it correct?
Well, hi Peter. My question is indeed rather about the incentive for the NMHS, because in my institute, financially the institute is under pressure, and therefore they need to find more money in their commercial activity. So I know in the US, for instance, that's the discussion we had last time. All the money is coming to the from the government, and that's it. I work in Belgium, and here it's different. So we are on the pressure. Its budget is lowering every year, and so we are really encouraged to develop the commercial activity. And therefore, my question is indeed if there is innovation under development inside it, but the institute currently would of course prefer to develop, but I agree that this is not the right vehicle, and therefore the question is, if there is an IP which is correctly organized, then you can transfer the IP and have a vehicle which is much more convenient, like a commercial company. You see?
Yeah. So I think I'm wading into territory that economists have fought over bloody wars for decades, right? I think funded institutions, competitive commercial activities is a direct pathway to market distortions. So I think that is, while it's obviously happening, I mean, you are just talking about it, that generally is seen as market distortion, right? And I think rightfully certain companies would say, well, this is pretty unfair. You can't go bankrupt, I can, right? I mean, there is, there definitely is an element of unfairness when you have publicly funded institutions starting to compete commercially, right? And if you were to then extend, well, we are looking for money, when you then, take Michael's questions before and say, like, well, academia should do the same thing. They should hoard their IP and says, well, I'm not giving it to you unless you pay me your money for it. You just end up with a very, very fragmented world where, data is definitely not free anymore, and knowledge isn't free anymore, either, which is even much worse. So I think my personal view is that we should leverage the strength of each of the three collaborating sides, public, private, and academia, and lean into their strengths, recognizing that every single strength has a weakness, right? And I think the strengths of the private sector is to operationalize inventions from academia and generate them at scale at very, very low cost. The private sector is not very good at inventing things. right? I mean, if we were to rely on inventions being done by the private sector, we would not exist.
Thanks, Peter.
I think our global economy, I think our global to expect. Sorry, that's it.
Okay, the voice was breaking right at the last minute. Anyway, we have another question from Alan Thorpe. The question is, there is sometimes an opinion expressed that a data service from a company will be more expensive than from the old way of working via procuring assets, hardware. For example, if the data service sells a piece of data multiple times, it has a perception that it is more expensive in total. How to overcome this perception? That's a question.
You know what? I've been wrestling with the source of this perception ever since I became aware of it. Because no one is claiming that Elsevier is more expensive because it sells its access to its subscription as a service, or that streaming music is more expensive than buying CDs, or then my operating system is more expensive now that I have it as a subscription than it was in the old days. So there is like this, it is really, really like we have like every one of us has a felt experience that buying things as a service is cheaper and better than buying things as an asset. We don't buy large hard drives for our home anymore, right? We don't buy CDs, every 6 months to upgrade our operating system. Right? Like most of us don't buy, CDs to listening to music anymore, right? We use the various streaming musics, right? Like most of us don't buy DVDs to watch the movies anymore. We have a subscription to, let's say, Netflix. So there is like kind of like a felt experience from most people on this planet that purchasing a service is actually a much, much better way than purchasing assets. The same thing has happened for most of the space industry. Purchasing imagery, purchasing satellite communication, purchasing launch. I think it's quite obvious that NASA has a cheaper transportation service by purchasing it from SpaceX and from Orbital ATK. Two. Thing service and to be there is no in a scale in any.
Peter, can you repeat the last phrase? It again was not heard.
Yeah, so there is simply no precedent for services being adopted that are more costly than buying assets. It just there just isn't a precedent that would support that notion of why it is cheaper for governments to buy telecommunication services, why it is cheaper for governments to buy imagery services, why it is cheaper for governments to buy launch services, but it would be more expensive for them to buy weather data services. There isn't any precedent for that, and so I'm continually surprised by it and continually trying to understand where that notion is coming from, because we don't see it anywhere else in the space industry. And we don't see it anywhere else in all sorts of other industry. I mentioned cloud computing, cloud storage, software services, music, reading, books, academic journals. Everywhere else, we don't see the case that purchasing a service is more expensive than purchasing an asset.
There is a question from Thomas Adams. And the question is, or this statement probably, I strongly disagree that the private sector provides solutions at the low cost. I believe the public sector is more efficacious. The US National Weather Service and Australian Bureau of Meteorology provide excellent examples of that. That is not to say that there is no role of the private sector.
So that's almost like a non sequitur, I would almost say, right? Because NOAA purchases its data from the private sector. NOAA purchases its computing power from the private sector. NOAA purchases all the software it uses from the private sector. As a matter of fact, the public and private sector have collaborated on providing solutions for decades. Like there's no one without the other. If you subtract the contributions of the private sector over the last 5 decades, you lose every single sensor that has ever been deployed, and you would lose every single satellite ever been deployed, because it has been built by the private sector. And if you subtract the public sector, you would similarly lose all of the advancements that we have made, because all of the predictions have been created by the public sector. The two are one side of a whole.
Well, maybe there is a confusion between who pays and who does provide service. The public sector pays for what is considered a public domain, be it observations which are foundational for early warning or forecasting.
Yep.
But that is
exactly.
Outsourced to private sector delivery, because they believe, many governments believe that that can be delivered more efficiently and with a high quality of product, and that's a competition. But anyway,
it's just I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, maybe, because as I said, the public sector purchases those assets from the private sector, and there is a transfer of money and there's a transfer of data that happens through that, and then the public sector provides those services, like the public weather forecast.
I can see in the chats that Mr. Adams commenting. I don't know whether it would make sense to have a offline discussion, or it's because he said, for instance, those statement, and I assume he meant your statements. These are not true, and he refers to his 30+ years of NOAA National Weather Service experience. I don't know whether we should spend time digging deep who is right, who is wrong, because clearly it indicates differences of opinion about what is what. Anybody else who has questions or other points to make, and ask Pete about his position on that. I don't see any chats, anything which is sort of interesting. Colleagues, as I said, you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. Well, unless there is, well, I don't see. Let me check my other gadget. To my surprise, there is no, maybe the last point, who is right, who is wrong in terms of this private delivery versus public delivery was important point to I found something from Jack Hayes. Government cost analysis many times does not include the organic resources needed to develop and operate observation systems. A cost savings is a service model. That was a comment. And in the meantime, there was somebody's...
This
yes.
is James Stalker. Can I make a comment?
Please go ahead.
Well, I only caught a little bit of the call here, but it seems like there's a lot of overgeneralization and oversimplification by Peter. Maybe that's by design, but that's what I think. We need to figure out that the traditional models of academic, government, and private sectors, those boundaries are really collapsing together. So, for example, when Peter says innovation doesn't happen in the private sector, that's not true. And only public sector folks own assets now, and that's not true too. So we need to really figure out how to go forward when the boundaries are collapsing like that. And also one point that Peter made, I thought that was great, and we need to emphasize that. The cost is not the only thing we should pay attention to. It should be the value. So if you look at benefit to cost ratio, that has to be high. And if it's not there and you're only competing on the cost, usually the value suffers. So I just want to make sure that we really have that out there.
Peter, do you want to comment on that last point?
Oh, I mean, I think James makes excellent points. Of course, it's very hard to do any subject, fully justice in a 25 minutes presentation. I do think that in some areas boundaries are changing between the three sectors. I think in other areas they are as relevant as they have always been. I grew up playing soccer, and I think yes, the differences between a defender and the striker at times have been a little bit less clear. But generally, when we make everyone a striker and everyone a defender, we might lose a little bit of the overall effectiveness of the team. And I think there is benefit to knowing what is the exact contribution that you can play to winning the game, rather than everyone trying to do everything, a little bit.
Okay, so specialization matters, in other words. Well, that. Okay, no other questions. So it seemed that everybody, unless there is somebody else.
Yeah, Vladimir, it's Rob Farley speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, Rob.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Thanks for your talk. I mean, you and I have discussed these points previously, and I think the real positive that you bring to this debate is to challenge a lot of us who've worked a long time in the public sector to think differently about how services can be delivered, how capabilities can be accessed, especially at times when public sector funding is under pressure, and challenging what often in the past has been inefficiency and lack of innovation in the public sector. But at the same time, inevitably, in a short presentation, there's a risk of overgeneralizing and under appreciating opportunities for a different balance between the public and private sector, and the fact that in different countries with different capabilities, that balance will sit in a different place. So I guess I would just want to temper your obvious enthusiasm for sort of a bigger private sector role by recognizing that there are different approaches, different business models, and what we all need to do is identify the best balance. I would as well point out that course, one of the really important skills that the public sector needs to develop more effectively if it's going to embrace successfully the new opportunities that exist is the ability to engage with the private sector in a commercially savvy way to be able to negotiate contracts that are fair for all and be able to manage those contracts in an effective way. And I think for many countries that we work with in the developing world, perhaps that's one of the biggest challenges, because if you don't have a well-performing customer as well as a well-performing supplier, then we just create problems down the road. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. And of course, this is meant as a debate. I want to push back on one statement, which is, that I would be advocating for a larger role of the private sector. That is patently not true. The way I look at it, if I were to maybe take a lens towards the space side of things, the private sector had about half of the role for the last few decades, and the public sector the other half. I feel that those two sides have had quite substantial roles in the global weather enterprise for the last few decades. And I'm actually not making any case that balance between the public side and the private side should change at all. I think the case that I'm trying to make is that there are new technologies and new business models emerging for the role that the private sector can play that is not making it larger. It's just making it more in line with how the private sector contributes to the public good happening in other space sectors or in a range of other public services by providing its value add not through an asset sale but as a service. That doesn't change the contribution of one side or the other. It is just creating an evolution of the partnership without changing the overall size of the participation from one side or the other. I think that's the only thing I would say here.
And I get that, and I would agree that in some instances that business model is really exciting and highly appropriate, and in other instances it just won't work. So again, we need to find the right mix.
Absolutely, and that's. I mean, I think there was a question early on about that mix of very, very large and very, very small and a hybrid infrastructure that then might evolve, have different business models around it. Absolutely, it's not one size rarely fits all. Fully 100% agree.
Yeah. Okay. I would also 100% agree with that. There is a statement of just point from Vladimir Rak from Slovakia. He says that in Slovakia, they have a very good experience with a close partnership of Slovak Hydrometeorological Institute and private companies. We produce and offer many commercial products together. Both profits are rising. Wow, that's probably an indication that this country found that proper mix, which seemed to be beneficial for all. Any comments, Peter?
I'm not familiar with the model in Slovakia, but I'm not surprised that those collaborations exist. I would say we also see it in larger instances. I mean, ECMWF is producing goods that have a substantial economic impact and is used from numerous corporations. NOAA, through the public availability of its GFS model, is powering some of the largest commercial weather prediction companies in the world. So clearly there are a great collaborations happening across the world, and I'd be excited to learn more about the particular way of how Slovakia has solved this, and what we all can learn from that.
Thanks. It seems that participants who are still 127 participants till that point are running out of steam in terms of raising questions. So unless we have more questions, we can proceed with closing. And I suppose to deliver a few final remarks. But to tell you the truth, I First of all, I wanted to thank, of course, Peter for taking time, presenting his, as always, very eloquent and very interesting opinions about development of private sector and a position from the private sector. We appreciate that. And as always, that position is quite valuable. For me, sitting in the institution which deals primarily with developing countries, I may only emphasize that indeed the road for the better future in developing countries will not be easy, particularly because there's boundaries, and some participants mentioned about this collapsing boundaries, and the whole evolution of this global weather enterprise is very fast, and to follow that changes in the many developing, least developed countries is very complicated. So we need a leadership, and I believe that presentations like today, Peter and other colleagues which participated in this global weather enterprise from public sector, we had great presentations from academic sector. We need to do it at scale. We need to continue this effort. And in fact, one of the points, Peter, you made about the innovation, connection between innovation and public sector, I particularly appreciated that, and connection with academia as well. And in the least developed countries, to my opinion, that's by far the largest problem, because you cannot grow academic sector and you cannot buy it from the shelf. It requires years and years, and environment from the government, universities, and other things which unfortunately are not easy to create. And so we should stay together and still communicate the benefits, particularly as you, Peter, mentioned, during the age of climate change, the emphasis to strengthening this the healthier and more powerful global weather enterprise should be scaled up. And that's the message which I collect from this interesting and important discussion from your side. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, dear participants. I hope you will join our next events. And I wanted to attract your attention to various information products, weather polls, which you can find on the site of the Global Weather Enterprise Forum. Thanks, Peter, again. Thanks, everybody.